welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alessandra Nadudvari, and I'm an author based in Nova Scotia, Canada. In my free time, I study the mystery of Oak Island and its legendary treasure. Even though I favor the Knights Templar theory, I'm open-minded and curious about other theories and other explanations too. Today, I will be speaking to an Oak Island theorist, James McQuiston, who has written several books about Oak Island, and he's very knowledgeable on this topic. James McQuiston's theory centers on a Scottish nobleman named Sir William Alexander. Sir William Alexander actually named Nova Scotia, which means New Scotland. So I'm very excited to pick James's brain and see what secrets he's going to reveal to us, because I'm sure that he knows way more than what he put in his books. The interview turned out to be 3 hours long, for which I apologize, but there was just so much that we had to cover. So I decided to divide it into 3 parts, and you are free to watch as much or as little of it as you wish. Thank you for your time and for your consideration. And now sit back, relax, and enjoy the interview with James McQuiston. Hello, James.
Hi.
How are you? Doing? I'm great.
Good. Long time no see. What, about 3 years, I think?
I know, right? We met in person in New Ross when you were filming an episode with the Oak Island crew, and we'll get to that. And now we meet again in cyberspace.
Yes. Yeah. The wonders of the world. Yeah, I think that was in 2018, I believe.
Time flies. Yeah. All right, James. So the reason why I decided to reach out to you is because you are one of the top Oak Island theories. I find that your theory is one of the best researched ones. And I'm very curious about how your theory evolved over the years, if your views or ideas have changed at all, and what you might have covered that we have not heard on the show, on the Curse of Oak Island.
Well, that right there will be a lot, that last one. Well, I knew that my family, a distant cousin, was the premier Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia. And I honestly didn't know what that even meant, but I'd emailed with a gentleman a few times. So I was just watching Curse of Oak Island one night, and it struck me, Oak Island, Nova Scotia, Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia. I wonder if they know about it. And honestly, I was kind of almost hoping they would tell me something when I emailed them. And then they gave me a call, which lasted about an hour, and they asked a lot of questions. So I was just making notes on the questions because I didn't know a lot of the answers, but I was curious about those same answers. So I started sending them emails, and eventually somebody from up there that that kind of runs the show in the background wrote and said, you need to write a book because we've sent all these emails back and forth and they're going to get lost. There's no record of them other than in the emails. And what I'd been doing was addressing some of the kind of the basic theories, you might say, the Glooscap theory. What was the story behind the Knights Templar? Could people actually sail across the North Atlantic before Columbus, which they could? And, the Henry Sinclair angle. And so I was answering those in separate emails. So when I wrote the book, to some degree, I grouped the emails that were around the same subject and made that a chapter. And so it's more of a general book, although I did touch on the Knights Baronet in it, but I didn't know too much about them at the time. So they had me come up in 2017 with the book. And so one of the questions Rick asked was, well, do these Knights Baronet you're talking about, are they related in any way to the Knights Templar? And I said, well, I haven't really looked into that, but I will. So like 6 days later, after I got home, I sent him this big long report of every knight baronet, because there's a number of lists of them. They vary slightly, but it's just from it's so old. It was 1625 when they started, but generally they're the same. So I was investigating each of the early ones, like I'd say the first 3 dozen, because they extended down through the years, but the story of Nova Scotia all takes place in the beginning of the Knights Baronet. And all of them had, all of the early ones had some kind of connection back to the Knights Templar, including William Alexander, who started the whole thing and founded Nova Scotia. He lived on Templar land that his grandfather bought, which was located just 7 miles from the Bannockburn battlefield, which is the battle where the Templars were thought to have helped Robert de Bruce win Scotland. And one thing that I found out about that surprised me, and I've never read it anywhere else, is that the Bannockburn battle happened almost 100 days after Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake. So, you kind of wonder, everything's so connected that you kind of wonder if that wasn't a revenge, So anyway, I talked to him that year, and I was actually the last person to present in the war room because they were tearing that one down, and they had built a new one. In fact, they were still hammering nails when I got there that day, and Charles had taken me for a ride, and I saw them working on that. I thought, wow, that looks like the old war room. What's that all about? And so after my presentation, I thought, well, I'm never going to be here again, which of course didn't turn out to be true. So I want to peek in the war room one more time. So I did, and there was a lady in there taking things off the wall. She would photograph a section, and then she had a box to put that, because they have tons of photographs. I think you've been in there, so you know, photographs and newspaper clippings and all that. So I said, what's going on? And she said, we're moving to the new war room. And I said, you mean I was the last one to present the old one? She said, yeah. And then she zipped her lips. She said, top secret. So I didn't say anything about that until I saw it finally online about a year later that somebody else was talking about it. And I said, oh yeah, I know about that. So, but anyway, and that was a cool year too, because this was before they built the new war room, there was easier access to the island, because there's a gate now to keep you from going up to the war room so tourists don't come up and spoil the filming. And so after Charles he took me to the McGuinness Foundation and around a number of places. So I sort of got the lay of the land, and I came back. He said, well, you know how to drive a golf cart, don't you? And I said, yeah. He said, go ahead and take it. So I was just going everywhere I thought a golf cart wouldn't get stuck. And then I got back, and there was a Prometheus producer there, and he said, hey, I want to take you to show you something. So he took me up to Samuel Ball's lot, and we couldn't get close to the foundation. He said, we don't have a permit yet. But we crawled over one of those big walls that he built. And we also, he said, look at this. And he took me, it was in a real thicket area, and there was like a 10 by 10 square foot area that had sunk like a foot. And the corners were like almost perfectly square. And it had growth, new trees growing and everything, but it was so obvious that there was something there. And I tell you, if I would have had a shovel, I would have started digging right on the spot. But so they did later dig that up, and they didn't find anything there. So anyway, that was that year. And then I found out about the Scots taking over Port Royal, which is on the opposite side on the leeward side of Nova Scotia. And so I found out that they'd been kicked out in 1632, and that the actual order reads March 29th. So I thought, well, could you even sail back across the North Atlantic in March or April, even if they went into April. And I found out through a lot of sources that you can't. And so, especially on an old wooden sailing ship. So then I got the theory, well, they probably pulled into Mahone Bay because it's the widest, deepest, I don't mean as far as how deep the water is, but deep into the land. And Oak Island's right at the back. And I later found out references to Oak Island being a refuge for even more modern ships. I don't mean steamers or anything like that, but more modern tall ships, because it blocked the wind. Before the causeway was there, you could pull right in behind it and just park there till the storm was over. And also because so many parts from ships had been found, I thought, well, the only way they would get there is if a ship wrecked, because people aren't just going to be throwing them off their ship or anything. So a ship must have wrecked. So on that next book, which was Oak Island 1632, I talked about everything I could find out about the Knights Baronet and about this expulsion in 1632, and the idea that they went there and likely buried something that they didn't want to take back with them. Because what I figure is they probably didn't know it was anything but more than a bump in the road, because they had been trying. The English had been struggling, and the Scottish were, at this point, under the wing of the English. They'd been struggling for like 20 years to get settlements from Cape Cod all the way up to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland even. So they wouldn't know that this wasn't that much different than any other year. Other colonies got chased out. So they may have just wanted to leave things that we might be coming back in 2 months. So why sail all this over there? We have a wrecked ship. We've got limited space for the people, whatever. So that's the theory I developed there. But I really worked on connecting the Freemasons to the Knights Baronet, and the earliest Freemasons were all Knights Baronet. And I actually have a facsimile of the actual record of the first three. And one of those, the first one, was the son of William Alexander Jr. So now I thought, wow, this is really pretty amazing stuff. And but I still don't know what kind of treasure there would be, and I didn't really know necessarily why they did it, other than I assumed they lost the ship. So they had me come back up in 2018, and that's when I got to come up to the New Ross Foundation, and we had been talking about that medallion, that 1671 medallion, found stone's throw away, is what we were told from your foundation. And so I had found some information on that, who it was originally given to, and I kind of came up with a theory of how it got there through William Phipps. So I was excited to talk about that, but I didn't know that they were going to try to get the gentleman that found it to come to the war room. And Doug was working really hard on it, but it was kind of going nowhere. And he wouldn't come up to the foundation that day either. His cousin did, but he wouldn't come up there. So I gave my presentation on that book, 1632, and what I'd found out about the connection with the Freemasons and all that. And then I think it was 2 days later, we came up to your place. And it was funny because people think the show's scripted, and it's not. But they do have to arrange arrivals, because how do they know when you're going to get there? They can't have cameras running 24/7. So the only thing they really arrange is an arrival. And so that little hill that goes up where we park, that goes up to your foundation, it's not a bad hill to walk once, but it's no fun walking it 3 times. And every time we'd get about halfway up there, a semi truck would go by, and the drone would pick up the sound, and they'd cancel it all, and we'd have to walk down to the bottom of the hill again, turn around, come up. Finally, the 3rd time we made it to the top of the hill, but it was well worth it. And and then the flies were biting so bad that day. Yeah, it was crazy. But so that kind of started to pique my interest in what is this New Ross Foundation. I mean, I was focused on the medallion that was found there, but I wasn't so much focused on the foundation. And so that started the ball rolling in my head, which led to my latest book, which we'll get to. But I had found out about this treasure that was stolen, and it was stolen by the world's third Freemason. He also happened to be the world's third Knights Baronet, and he was indicted and waiting trial for 2 years, and his trial kept getting delayed. And then all of a sudden, he got a pardon from the king, and he became William Alexander's partner in Nova Scotia. He signed a document saying he would finance a ship to go to Nova Scotia. So I got to thinking, well, I'm a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. I'm a fellow there. And so I emailed them and I asked them, do you know about this treasure and do you know where it is? So by the time it was over, I had the National Museum of Scotland and the National Records of Scotland all working on it. And they knew about the stolen treasure, but nobody knew where it went. There's no record of where the bulk of it ended up. So then I got to thinking, well, it's obvious that this man, his name was Strachan, it's obvious that he spent some of the money on Nova Scotia because he financed the ship to go there, and he also purchased the Knight Baronet title, because that was one thing different about the Knight Baronets. Other knights would gain their knighthood by service to the king, generally in battle overseas or whatever. In this case, I guess they determined that they probably are going to have battles overseas, so they gave him the knighthood ahead of time, but you had to pay a hefty fee for it, and you had to supply 6 men of some kind of skill, like a stonemason or a leather worker or somebody that could build, carpenter, because their goal was to build towns all the way around Nova Scotia. They wanted to make 100 towns all the way around the coast to protect Nova Scotia. And so then I thought, well, geez, that could be the treasure, since nobody knows where that treasure went. And so I had that in the next book, which was Oak Island Knights. And the reason why I called it Knights was because it not only talked about the Knights Baronet, but it talked about the Order of the Garter, which was that medallion that was found up at your house. And so that in a sense is my most complete theory. Everything else is icing on that cake. So I went up the next year to talk about that. And that was funny that year, because that would be 2019, because the year before, well, the first 2 meetings were 2 hours per meeting. And they didn't use any of the original filming in the old war room. And they only used, maybe 15-minute segment or less, 10 or 15-minute segment of the second meeting. So I thought, well, I'm going to beat them at their own game, because I'm going to make my presentation only be an hour. And then if they use 10 or 15 minutes, they'll use proportionally a bigger chunk of my presentation. So I practiced and threw this out and threw that out and everything to get this thing down to an hour. And they'd been out in the field working all day, and they were dog tired when they came in. You could just see it in them. And yet they kept me in there for 4 hours asking questions. And I was getting tired. Well, I had flown that day, so I was a little bit tired from that. But these poor guys have been out there in the field working. But they kept us in there for 4 hours. And that year, I happened to just start talking about the stonemasons, and they stopped the meeting for a minute. Somebody left, came back and handed something to Gary behind his back. And then they said, well, what were you saying about, they said, well, let's get going again. What were you saying about the stonemasons? And I had no idea what was up. I thought, maybe somebody had used the restroom or something. I didn't know what was happening. And as I'm talking about them, Gary lifts that stonemason's finishing chisel up on the table and hands it to me. And I'm like, oh, wow. So I said, oh, that's the stonemason's finishing symbol or chisel. And Rick says, well, how do you know that? I said, well, it's obvious what it is. And I think that one of the phenomena that I've seen is that everybody wants to be so accurate that they overlook the obvious, or they don't give the obvious credit. Like, this is obviously this, but we better look into it and make sure that this is this, you know, because they don't want to present something that's not accurate. So, and I have to tell you that you're talking about organizing the arrival, as I was talking about when we got to your place, had to walk up the hill 3 times. So that year, they said, all right, well, okay, they're just about ready for you. They're all collecting in the war room. So just drive across the causeway and come back over, and we'll film you coming over, then go up, park on the left-hand side of the trucks that are there and go in, and Rick will meet you at the door, which all was pretty simple stuff. So I did that, and there was Rick, met me at the door. Well, there was only 2 trucks, so I expected maybe 4 people or something. Everybody was in there except Dan. Dan wasn't in there. But I mean, the place was just packed full. And when I walked through the door, it was such a shock. I said, wow, you brought the whole family. And the producer said, oh, wait a minute, don't say that, please. Can you just walk back in the door without saying that? So that is the only time that they told me what to say, and it was actually what not to say. But I mean, it was just such a shock because you see 2 vehicles and you see 8 or 10 people in there. So a lot of them must have just walked in from being out in the field. So anyway, and that year, and this is still a mystery, and I don't want to name the institution, but Doug and I had set up a meeting with an institution that I had connected to Oak Island in 8 different ways. And we emailed with the archivist, and we had the meeting all set up. We had sent them the list of what we wanted to talk about. And in that meeting, in the war room meeting, Doug announced that they had mysteriously canceled the meeting. And so we haven't, to this day, they gave them no reason why they canceled the meeting. And of course, our thought was we were getting too close up to something here. So after the next day after that meeting, I went to the Nova Scotia archives, and there was Doug sitting there working away, doing his research that he does so great. And so I was talking to him, and I said, wasn't that wild that they canceled that? And he said, I heard that they have a whole room, a basement room full of Oak Island artifacts that nobody's seen since the 1970s. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I said, you know what? My suggestion is make friends with one of their janitors, and then he'll take you in at night and see them all. So I don't know if he ever, because he said, I'm trying to figure out a way to get a foot in the door there. And so I said, make friends with the janitor. So we have never heard any more about that. But if that rumor is true, there's a bunch of artifacts just sitting there waiting to be carbon dated or analyzed at the university or whatever. So that was a good meeting, and again, they kept me in there 4 hours, but they still only used a 10 or 15-minute segment of it. But at that point, I'd been on 5 times by the end of that year, and then in 2020, I got a call that they wanted to do a Zoom with me because of COVID and all that. So I worked and worked and worked to get my old laptop to work. This iPad is so much better. I spent a week trying to get ready for that meeting. And then it turned out they had the technical difficulties, not me. It was so funny. They were fighting probably 15 minutes worth of technical difficulties because they were trying to get everybody. Marty was coming in on a computer, and Alex, I think, and can't remember who else. Oh, Craig. And then other people were in the war room. Billy was in there at the time. It was the first time I saw him. And so that, again, I'm thinking they're not going to want to be on Zoom for probably any more than an hour. They had me in there 3 hours on the Zoom meeting. So I gained a lot of insight on how these things happen. And that's been fun right there. So I don't know if I answered the question you originally asked, but.
You did. And I would like to ask you some follow-up questions based on that. So to summarize your theory, it begins in the 1600s, and the story begins in Scotland. And the treasure that you believe is buried on Oak Island originated in Scotland. And not only that, you know what was in it. So can you tell us, me and my audience, what items were in that treasure and what we could expect to be found on Oak Island if the treasure hunters are successful.
Well, the treasure list is actually a complete page long. There were so many items. One of them was 26,000 pounds worth of Portugal coins called ducats. And I tried to analyze the whole treasure because you're taking different denominations from 400 years ago, so it's pretty difficult. And then there's like 4 different criteria for what they're worth now. One is just their raw value. The other is comparative wages. Another one is the price of gold. Another one, the craziest one, is influence in the economy, because if you're a millionaire in the United States, you're one of a million millionaires, whatever. But if you're a millionaire in Haiti, you're the president, you know. I mean, so you just have more influence. So, and that's the highest. But there was a picture frame of she was the princess of, I believe, Denmark, but she married King James, and Princess Anne, I believe was her name. And there was a picture of her that had diamond-studded frame. There were rings. There were 2 gold chains, which we know that pieces of a gold chain were brought up from the money pit at one point. Just any number of types of coins. One thing that was out of the ordinary from everything else was I guess they call it a bleeding stone. It was it was a stone that supposedly healed you, which is kind of odd because everything else was some spendable item or something. But it was it had quite a worth applied to it. So there was just I'm guessing 30 to 40 items listed, and one item could be 26,000 coins, or whatever. So gold buttons. There were 36 dozen gold buttons. And what I found out is that when men would wear coats with gold buttons on them, and then if they ran into a creditor at a party, for instance, they'd say, "Oh, I owe you that," and they'd pop one of the gold buttons off and hand it to them. But the last item on the list was it was called a grit cloth bag containing the title deeds to certain castles. Now, this gentleman that was robbed owned 30 castles, and they said he could sleep anywhere in Scotland and still be in his own home. So I didn't know what was meant by grit cloth bag, and grit cloth is a kind of sandpaper they use finishing cars when you're painting cars. But I knew they couldn't mean that. So I contacted the Scotland Museum, and they put me in touch with their actual curator of ancient materials. And she said that meant a great cloth bag or a great canvas bag. And what they would do, because they didn't know, most of the castles stayed in families for hundreds of years. So the title for it had to be in good shape. So what they would do is they would write it in India ink on parchment, roll it up in canvas, and dip it in candle wax 3 times. And that would make it waterproof. Well, we know that a drill bit hit something in the money pit that had to have been waterproof when it was hit, and pulled it up, and it was a piece of parchment with Indian ink. And if it had been flooded, the money pit had already been flooded for a long time at that point. So it had to have been in some kind of waterproof container, and it just didn't get wet enough by the time it got to the top for the India ink to smear. And so I was pretty excited about now finding out that there were parchment deeds were part of this robbery. And I never got to see the parchment that was brought up, but I did talk to Rick about it, and he said they had it tested for parchment. It's absolutely parchment. They're reluctant to test it for DNA, or because it at what time was an animal, or whether it's absolutely India ink, because it's so small that they probably will destroy it or destroy a good chunk of it. And so the jury's out on whether they should go any further on trying to figure out what that parchment was. So Gary found a gold-plated button in the spoils from the money pit, which isn't necessarily the same as a gold button, but they found the parchment back in 1897, and then they, at the time, supposedly found 3 links of gold chain. So those 3 items would roughly fit what was in there. And the thing about it is, people say, well, that was so long ago, how can you prove that they did that? Well, I think it was Frederick Blair, and it might have been one of the Chapels, but yeah, it was one of the Chapels. Actually went before a notary and wrote out a form and said, yes, I found this on this day. The witnesses were blah, 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 blah. And then he signed it so that people would quit questioning whether it was a real find. So, but what's interesting about the treasure is that, as you know, my theory, and it's not just, I'm only basing it on what some of the Mi'kmaq told Joan Harris and what the Alexander family says, and on known Nova Scotia history, is that foundation up there, the building was torn down in 1654 based on those 3 sources. And also in 1654, they found a treasure chest out on the Orkney Islands at the top of Scotland that had belonged to L. Strachan's wife. And she had sent it up to her son, who was living up there, but for some reason he didn't get it. And so they opened that treasure chest in front of a bunch of witnesses, and it had about 6 items in it that were all jewelry, that sounded like it could have been from the treasure. It wasn't 100% specific, but it was that same style of treasure. And of all things, the man that they sent it to was William Phipp's father. Or no, I'm sorry, Christopher Monk's father. Christopher Monk was the man who financed William Phipps to go get the Concepcion treasure. So, and there's letters from Monk up to them. You make sure you give it to so-and-so, he's going to bring it to me, and all that. So it just tightens the tapestry so much to have Christopher Monk's father getting that treasure. And then the same year, Sedgwick is coming up from Boston, according to the Alexander family and according to what the Mi'kmaq told Joan Harris, to tear down that fort. And we know that Sedgwick made it as far as La Have, which is only like 40 to 50 miles away from, I know you guys talking kilometers and I don't know them, but it's not too far away. And if they were there to sort of dominate and oust people they didn't want or capture them or whatever, they certainly would have went 40 more miles. And in fact, they might have come overland from Port Royal overland and down to La Have, and that would take them right smack through New Ross. So the history of him being there, in fact, his men were in La Have till 58 because the French had sent a new governor over and he didn't know they were waiting for him. And he landed at La Have and they arrested him on the spot. So we know that they were there from 54 to 58, only 40 miles from your place. And the Alexander family has a website that says that he tore it down in 54. And the Mi'kmaq told Joan, and it wasn't just one person. Her main source was a man named John Noss. I don't know if you've ever been able to talk to him or not, but he and I shared a number of emails. They were short, but we shared them, and he had written quite a bit about Joan, and she had written about his help. But he wasn't the only one, because she had met 2 other Mi'kmaq gentlemen that told her roughly the same story that John did. So this is multi-sourced that this happened. And as you know from my book, there's, I won't spill the whole beans, but New Ross used to be called Charring Cross. Well, even after I wrote the book, I got to thinking, well, Champlain named Port Mutton in 1604, and that name stuck all the way since then. He named Port Royal in 1605, and that name stuck. So why couldn't Charing Cross stick? Why would we think, well, it couldn't be that old? How could that name possibly be that old? Well, these other names are that old.
James, what is the significance of the name Charing Cross? Can you tell me?
Well, I could. It'll spill the beans on my book, but I will. So, William Alexander lived in London at this place called Covent Gardens, which, by the way, was the architect for it was Inigo Jones. Right down the road from him, like a third of the mile, was Charing Cross, which was a directional cross that measured all the distances to London, and it still does today, even though the cross got torn down by Oliver Cromwell. Now there's a statue of Charles I there on a horse, but it's still what they call the notional point of England. And so it isn't notional, just means an arbitrary chosen point. Doesn't mean that geographically it's the center or anything. It just means they had to pick a point somehow. So that's the point they picked, because there was already this medieval cross there. So they just picked that point. It was called the Charing Cross because that area used to be called Charring before it became part of London. So you have William Alexander living, again, maybe about a third of the mile. I haven't had an GPS person go check all this out yet, but you folks helped with the one in New Ross. But the one in New Ross is approximately the same distance away from the foundation. And it was called Charing Cross. And those are the only two places in all of history, in all of any records anywhere, that were called Charing Cross. So my theory is that Alexander built that, had the estate built there. Joan Harris Hope, she wrote under the name Joan Hope because that was her maiden name. She mentions Inigo Jones 8 times as being the architect of your foundation. And historically, Inigo Jones is the architect of William Alexander's townhouse by the original Charing Cross in London. And so I looked up, I thought, well, if it was built in 1623, which is that's what the Alexander family says, and that's what the Mi'kmaq say. And that was the year he got his first ship to reach Nova Scotia. What was Inigo Jones doing that year? Well, I found out that he ended one project in 1622, started another one in 1623. I don't know when in 1623, but that was a big project that lasted many years. So he had a window there where he wasn't working on anything in London. So it's possible that he came over on that ship, it's called the St. Luke, in 1623 and more or less designed the foundation. And William Alexander sent 17 ships that I can count so far over a span of a number of years. And the second one was the first one to make it there in 1623. And he doesn't say that he was on that boat, but I have at least 2 reasons to believe he was. One is that is the most detailed description of any of the trips of any of the ships that went over. He talks about how they went into this harbor and they went 3 harbors down and they found certain kind of flora and fauna and all this stuff. And he would have had, even when I was reading that originally and I hadn't had the thought yet, did have the thought, well, he must have really debriefed people on that boat for him to know all this stuff. And but this estate was meant to be secret because the French still controlled Nova Scotia at the time. So he wasn't going to, he had to be secretive of what he was doing. But the other reason is because one of his best friends was William Vaughan, who owned a similar colony, was attempting a similar colony in Newfoundland. And he actually went over to see his colony. And so I thought, well, here's William Alexander. He's just been given a piece of land that's almost as big as Scotland. And it's just sitting there wild and ready to reap the beaver and the gold and lumber and everything you think that somebody that ambitious is going to sit home and wonder what his prize looks like? He's going to get on a boat and go over there and see it. And in 1626, King Charles actually wrote a land called Nova Scotia, previously discovered and surveyed by the travel and pains of William Alexander. So he is saying that William Alexander traveled there,
Excuse me.
and he's also and also that he surveyed the place. So why would he say that if it wasn't true? Just 3 years later, why would he say William Alexander traveled there? And there were no other boats yet. There was 1623, and then the next boat didn't go till 1628. So the only ship that he could have possibly been on to travel there was that 1623 ship, which would put him right there where the Alexander family and the Mi'kmaq say that your foundation was built. So, you know, there's no evidence to the contrary. And so may not absolutely prove it in a court of law, but what's the prosecution or whatever going to present? Because there's nothing to present. There's no evidence that isn't the case, and there's a lot of evidence that it was.
James, it sounds like you think that the Scottish settlers hid their treasure on Oak Island, but then Sir William Alexander, who was their leader, resided not on Oak Island, but at New Ross. Did I get that right?
Well, whether he stayed there very long or not, I believe he was there when that was built, and his son stayed there. One son was said to have had a son born there in 1625 named John. And then in 1630, he deeded all that area to a Frenchman and his son. See, his goal was to have peace and prosperity for everyone. So he had sent Sagamo Sejip, who was, Sagamo means the chief of the Mi'kmaq, to London to meet the king, and with his son and his wife. And in the meantime, William Alexander's son, William Jr., fathered a child with the daughter of Sagamo Sejip in Port Royal. And there's a lot of evidence that is the source for the LeBlanc family in Nova Scotia. Daniel LeBlanc was the first one they know about. And so I think various Alexander members and maybe other associated families were staying there as their base. I think they were spying on the French from there originally, because I did read a paragraph or two that said that they spied on the French before they took Port Royal. And the sea captain that I talked to up there, that Rick set the meeting up with, he said, can you imagine spying on them by sailing your tall ships right into their port? He said the only way they could have spied on them was overland. And he said it's probably the only way they could have chased them out, too, because he said they'd be sitting there in their fort with their cannons all trained on the bay, and you'd be pulling in your tall ships and get your mast blown off. So he said, I think that they not only spied from New Ross, but they attacked from New Ross. So then, and the Alexander family says that the estate was first abandoned in 1630, which was the date of the deed, that when it was given to this French father and son, and they became knights baronet. So originally it was, you could say it was owned by William Alexander, because he technically owned all of, at least in the minds of the British, he technically owned all of Nova Scotia. Then he deeded that to the Latours, Claude and Charles Latour. And so now they were owners potentially of Oak Island. I think I've presented enough evidence to prove that. And they were knights baronet. Well, then eventually, after a lot happened up there, Charles, the son, sold his grant there to a man named Thomas Temple, who Charles II made a knights baronet. So you have three successive knights baronet, Claude Latour, Charles Latour, and Thomas Temple, all knights baronet, owning that area. And before them was William Alexander, who created the knights baronet. So there's a long, long history there of 70 to 80 years or so of knights baronet being located in that area.
You said that the Alexander estate in Neuros was torn down by Oliver Cromwell's men. They were led
Yes.
by Robert Sedgwick.
Yes.
And it sounds like Oliver Cromwell destroyed Charing Cross twice, once in London and then the
Well,
second
that's
time
true.
in Nova Scotia, right? Why was he so hell bent on this kind of destruction? By him, I mean Oliver Cromwell. Why did Oliver Cromwell want to just destroy, destroy, destroy?
Well, he was absolutely against royalty. That was the main thing. And um, he led the parliamentarians who the kings had constantly just dissolved parliament. If things weren't going their way, they would just dissolve parliament, and then they'd start it up again a few years later, thinking everybody learned their lesson. And so it was meant to be a democratic, with the small d, democratic movement for the people, but power corrupts, and Cromwell basically put himself in as king, even though he never had a coronation or didn't wear a crown. But and it turned out that he was a pretty ruthless person, so a lot of people got tortured and killed under him. But he was specifically wanting to get rid of royalty, and which would be he beheaded Charles I to start with, and Alexander had tutored Charles I when he was a kid, and he was like King James' best friend. He helped him translate the Bible and particularly the Psalms of King David. So he was like a king himself, and I actually point out 9 reasons why I believe William Alexander intended to set himself up as king of Nova Scotia. Once he could get a foothold there, he was going to just name himself king of Nova Scotia. That's in my latest book. It's in some of the other ones too. But so Cromwell was after anybody that was associated with the king and anybody that was associated with the Alexander family. So he had actually captured David Alexander, who was a cousin who had sailed, captained 2 of the ships that went to Nova Scotia. He had Christopher Monk's father, I think his name was George Monk, arrest William Alexander's son-in-law, who was Robert Monroe. And from the same Monroe family, we have John Monroe as a settler on Oak Island. Alexander Strachan, or Al Strachan, some records say he died long before this Cromwellian movement, but a person from his line, John Strachan, owned the Nolan Cross lots during the early 1800s, and there were just in my book, a number of my books, but Oak Island and the Mayflower, I talk about it a lot, were from either the Freemasons who originated out of the Knights Baronet, and I have the proof in my book of that, the Knights Baronet families, or people from the Mayflower or the Plymouth colony. And so all of those people would have known that something happened in that area, because the reason William Alexander was given Nova Scotia was because of the Mayflower Pilgrims, because that colony didn't turn out as good as they thought it was going to. Number one, they were going to send 2 ships, and one of them sprung a leak, so they only had half the people, and then they got hit so bad with scurvy, and they had a few skirmishes with the natives, so their numbers had dropped so fast that, and the French were right up there at Port Royal, and it was literally like a 3-day sail down. They could have wiped out all of the Plymouth colony. And again, you can't look at it as a single event of the Plymouth colony. They'd been trying for 20 years just to get the Plymouth colony. People think it was just a bunch of pilgrims got on a boat and sailed there. All these powerful men, Sir Francis Bacon, William Alexander, Sir Fernando George, his name looks like it says gorgeous, but it was pronounced George. They are like the forefathers of a British settlement in Americas, and all of them were involved in the Plymouth colony, and 2 of them, George and William Alexander, were involved in founding Nova Scotia. So because they were so intricately tied, and it's a short sail away, 3-day sail away, they had to be paying attention that everything was going on, because it was a matter of life and death for them. It wasn't like, well, I'm just curious about what's going on up there. It's like something better be going on up there, or we could be dead, you know? So that history is all tied together. And I never realized it was tied so closely together. So, and one little side note is that the other ship that was supposed to go was the Speedwell. The ancestor of the Chapels, Mel Chapel and Melbourne, well, it's Melbourne and his brother, and there were three of them. I can't remember the names right off the bat, but they were descended from the guy who bought the Speedwell after it went back home. So what that means, I don't know, but it's just one more of those little strings that ties everything together.